walls had never failed. For 1,000 years, they had stood between civilization and collapsed, towering stone defenses that turned back empires and outlasted kings. Persians broke against them. Arab armies circled and withdrew. Crusaders, Bulgars, and warlords all tested their strength and failed. Constantinople was not just a city, it was the last echo of Rome. But in the spring of 1453, as thunder rolled across the Bosporus, not from the sky, but from something far more deliberate, the illusion of invincibility began to crack, because this time, the enemy did not come with ladders and swords alone. They came with a new kind of power. Gunpowder. And at their head stood a young ruler who believed destiny had chosen him for this moment, Sultan Mehmed II. He was only 21 years old, but he carried a vision far older than himself. To conquer Constantinople was to do what no one else had done. To take the city was to claim the legacy of Rome. It was not just a military objective, it was a statement to the world, and Mehmed intended to make it. By the mid-15th century, Constantinople was a shadow of its former glory. Once, it had ruled vast territories. Now, it controlled little more than the city and fragments of land. Its population had dwindled. Its treasury was strained. Its allies were distant and unreliable. Yet despite its decline, the city still held immense symbolic power. It sat at the crossroads of continents where trade routes from Asia met the markets of Europe. Whoever controlled Constantinople controlled the flow of goods, wealth, and influence between East and West. And for the rising Ottoman Empire, that made it indispensable. The Byzantines knew this. Their emperor, Constantine, understood the danger closing in. He was not blind to reality. He knew reinforcements from Western Europe were unlikely to arrive in time if they came at all. But he also knew something else. The walls had held before, and if they held again, the city might survive. Those walls were legendary. 3 layers deep, reinforced with towers and fortified gates. They stretched across the land like a stone spine. In front of them lay a moat. Behind them stood centuries of history. They had been tested again and again, but never like this. Mehmed's army was not just large, it was engineered for siege warfare. Tens of thousands of soldiers gathered, infantry, cavalry, elite janissaries, and specialists trained to break the unbreakable. And then there were the cannons. At the center of Mehmed's strategy was a weapon, unlike anything the world had seen, a massive bombard, designed to smash walls. It took weeks to transport. Dozens of oxen dragged it across rough terrain. When it fired, the ground trembled, and when its stone projectiles struck the walls of Constantinople, they did not bounce. They cracked them. The siege began in April 1453. At first, it seemed like every siege before it. Encampments formed. Lines were drawn, but then the cannons spoke. Day after day, the bombardments continued. The walls that had endured for centuries began to fracture under relentless assault. Inside the city, defenders worked without rest. By night, they repaired what had been destroyed by day, hauling stones, reinforcing weak points, patching breaches before the next sunrise. It was a race against time, and for a while, they kept up. Each day the walls still stood, felt like a small victory. Each repelled assault brought another moment of hope. But Mehmed was not relying on patience alone. He was adapting. The Golden Horn was guarded by a massive iron chain stretched across its entrance. It prevented enemy ships from entering. So Mehmed chose not to break it. He chose to go around it. In one of the most audacious maneuvers, Ottoman forces began dragging ships over land. Logs were laid down, greased to reduce friction. Under cover of darkness, crews pulled vessels across hills into the waters. By morning, the impossible had happened. Ottoman ships floated inside the Golden Horn. Behind the city's defenses, the Byzantines woke to a new reality. They were no longer just holding a wall. They were surrounded. Inside Constantinople, tension tightened like a drawn bow. Supplies were limited. Every soldier mattered, yet morale did not collapse. If anything, it hardened, because the defenders knew what was at stake. This was the last remnant of an empire that had carried Roman identity through 1,000 years of change. And for Emperor Constantine XI, surrender was not an option. He walked the walls. He spoke to his soldiers. He prepared not for survival but for sacrifice. Outside, Mehmed prepared for something else. Not just a siege. A conclusion. Weeks of bombardment had weakened key sections. The defenders were exhausted. The city was cut off. Now, he would deliver the final blow. But what came next would determine the fate of continents. Because when the walls finally gave way, the world itself would begin to change. By late May, Constantinople was running out of time. The walls still stood, but they were no longer the walls of legend. Cracks spread like veins through ancient stone. Sections had been reduced to rubble and hastily rebuilt, until strength gave way to exhaustion. Inside the city, the defenders were stretched to their limits. There were no reserves left. Every man who could carry a weapon was on the walls. Emperor Constantine the 11th knew it. His commanders knew it. Even the civilians could feel it in the constant thunder of artillery, the smoke drifting through the air, the growing silence between hopeful rumors. Still, no one spoke of surrender. Beyond those walls stood an army that had come not just to conquer, but to end something, and everyone understood what that meant. Sultan Mehmed II had been patient. He had tested the defenses, adjusted his tactics, worn down the city piece by piece. Now, he was ready to finish it. His plan was simple and but overwhelming in execution. A final, coordinated assault. Wave after wave of soldiers would strike the same weakened points along the walls, forcing the defenders to fight without rest. In the early hours of May 29th, before the sun rose, the attack began. At first, it was distant, low murmur beyond the walls. Drums pounded. War cries echoed across the darkness. Torches flickered as thousands of soldiers surged forward. The first wave hit like a storm. Irregular troops lightly equipped, numerous, relentless rushed. Toward the walls, their purpose was not to win. It was to exhaust. They climbed ladders, threw themselves against defenses. Arrows flew. Stones dropped. The defenders pushed them back again and again. As the first wave faltered, a second took its place. More organized, better equipped, more dangerous. They pressed harder, probing weak points, forcing defenders to shift positions, to stretch thinner and thinner. Still, the city held, but Mehmed had been waiting. Then came the Janissaries, elite soldiers, disciplined, silent in their advance. They targeted the most damaged sections of the wall where artillery had done its worst. And this time the line began to break. Amid the chaos, something small changed everything. A gate. A postern gate was either left unsecured or forced open in the confusion, until suddenly, the battle was no longer just on the walls. It was inside the city. At the same time, the relentless bombardment had finally taken its toll. A major section of the wall collapsed under pressure. Enough for the Janissaries to push through. Enough for the defenders to lose control. The momentum shifted completely. Emperor Constantine XI saw what was happening. He understood that the battle was lost, but he did not retreat. He did not flee. He removed the symbols of his rank, his imperial insignia, and chose to fight as a soldier among soldiers. He rode into the chaos, and he was never seen again. With the walls breached, Ottoman forces poured into Constantinople. The streets filled with confusion, fire, and fear. Sultan Mehmed II entered the city, not as a destroyer, but as a ruler. He made his way to its heart too, the Hagia Sophia, the great cathedral that had defined the city for centuries. Inside, it was filled with people. Mehmed ordered it to be converted into a mosque, not destroyed, not erased, transformed. The city would become something new. Istanbul, the capital of the Ottoman Empire, a center of power for centuries to come. But beyond the walls, something even larger had begun. Its consequences would reshape economies and ignite exploration. What happened on May 29, 1453, did not end with the city. It was only the beginning. When Constantinople fell, the world did not immediately understand what had happened. There was no instant realization that history had turned a corner. No single moment where nations paused and said everything is different now. But slowly, unmistakably, the consequences began to unfold, and they reached far beyond the shattered walls of a single city. For centuries, Constantinople had been a gateway. It connected Europe and Asia not just geographically, but economically. Spices, silt, precious metals, and ideas flowed through its markets. Merchants relied on its position. Now, that gateway belonged to the Ottoman Empire, and access to it had changed. Trade routes once moved freely were now subject to new control, new taxes, and uncertainties. For European powers, this created a problem that demanded a solution. If the old roads were no longer reliable, new ones would have to be found. This pressure gave rise to one of the most transformative periods in human history. The Age of Exploration. European kingdoms began investing in maritime ventures, sending ships into unknown waters in search of direct paths to Asia. It was a gamble, one that would reshape the planet. Within decades, explorers began to push beyond familiar boundaries. New sea routes were mapped, distant lands were reached, and eventually, entirely new continents entered the awareness of European powers. The fall of Constantinople did not cause this shift alone, but it accelerated it. At the same time, warfare itself was undergoing a transformation. The siege had demonstrated something undeniable. The age of walls was ending. The cannons used by Mehmed, second roll _01, proved that even the strongest defenses could be broken. After 1453, military architects across Europe began to rethink everything. Walls became lower, thicker, angle designed to absorb impact rather than resist it, because the lesson was clear. If Constantinople could fall, any city could. Culturally, the effects were just as profound. As the city fell, scholars and artists fled westward, carrying with them ancient texts preserved in Byzantine libraries, works of philosophy, science, and literature rooted in ancient Greece. And Rome began to circulate, and they helped fuel what would become the Renaissance, a revival of learning. Religion, too, felt the impact. Constantinople had long been the center of Eastern Orthodox Christianity. Its fall sent shockwaves through the Christian world. It deepened divisions and reshaped how power and faith interacted. At the same time, the Ottoman Empire emerged, not just as a political force but as a major center of Islamic power. But beyond all the large-scale consequences, there is something more human at the center of this story. An Emperor Roll _02 who chose to stand and fight, knowing the outcome, and a young Sultan Roll _01 who reshaped history before the age of 25. Constantinople did not fall quietly. It resisted. It endured. And in the end, it transformed. Under Ottoman rule, it became Istanbul, a thriving capital, a center of culture, trade, and power for centuries to come. History often feels like a series of long, gradual changes, but sometimes everything shifts at once. May 29th, 1453 was one of those days. Not just because a city fell, but because what rose from its fall reshaped the world that followed. The fall of Constantinople wasn't just the end of an empire. It was the beginning of a new era, a world that we still live in now.